Is a Tuesday morning in November of 1951, and a 23-year-old college student named Paul is walking down a corridor at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. He is carrying a cup of coffee. He is thinking about a letter he needs to write to his mother. He is not thinking about anything unusual because nothing unusual has happened yet. He turns into a room where 7 other young men are already seated in a row of chairs facing a wall, and he takes the only remaining chair at the end of the row. A researcher tells the group that they will be taking a simple visual perception test. Paul looks at the card the researcher holds up. It shows a single vertical line on the left side. Then the researcher holds up another card. This one shows 3 vertical lines of different lengths, labeled A, B, and C. The task, the researcher explains, is simply to identify which of the 3 lines on the second card matches the length of the line on the first card. Paul looks at the lines. The answer is obvious. It is clearly line C. The first man in the row says A. The second man says A. The third man says A. The fourth man says A. The fourth man says A. The fifth man says A. The sixth man says A. The seventh man says A. Paul is the last to answer. Paul looks at the lines again. They have not changed. He looks at the faces of the other 7 men. They look calm. They look certain. They look like people who have just said A. Paul opens his mouth. The question this video exists to answer is not what Paul said. The question is what you would have said. And I want to be specific about that, because it is easy to believe that this question is about someone else, about some weaker or less intelligent type of person, someone who does not know themselves as well as you know yourself. It is exactly this belief, the belief that you are the exception, that the human code was made to examine, because the data does not agree with you, and the data is not gentle. To understand what was happening in that room in Pennsylvania, and what it means about you specifically, you need to understand the man who built it. Solomon Asch was born in Warsaw in 1907, the son of a Jewish innkeeper. He emigrated to the United States as a teenager, speaking almost no English, and worked his way through City College of New York before earning his doctorate from Columbia in 1932. By the time he arrived at Swarthmore as a faculty member in the late 1940s, he had already developed a reputation as one of the most careful and morally serious psychologists of his generation. He was not interested in psychology as an abstract science. He was interested in it because of what had happened in Europe. He had watched from across an ocean as ordinary people in one of the most educated and culturally sophisticated nations on earth had participated in, or stood silent before, or simply failed to resist, something that should have been unresistible. He wanted to understand the mechanism, not the sociology, not the economics, not the ideology. The mechanism inside the individual human mind that allowed a person to override what they knew to be true. Asch had a specific intellectual opponent in mind when he designed his experiment. That opponent was a psychologist named Muzafer Sharif, who had conducted experiments in the 1930s using something called the autokinetic effect, a phenomenon where a stationary point of light in a dark room appears to move because the eye has no reference point to anchor it to. Sharif had shown that when people were asked in groups to estimate how far the light moved, their individual estimates converged toward a group norm over repeated trials. He concluded that social pressure could shape perception itself. Asch found this conclusion philosophically unsatisfying, even evasive. Sharif's situation was genuinely ambiguous. There was no objectively correct answer about a light that appeared to move but did not. Asch thought this made it too easy. Of course, people deferred to the group when they were genuinely uncertain. The real question was, what happened when they were not uncertain at all? What happened when the answer was plain? So he made the answer plain. He designed comparison cards where the correct match was unmistakable to anyone with normal vision. The lines differed in length by as much as 1 3/4 inches. In pilot testing, when subjects made the judgments alone, the error rate was less than 1%. Less than 1%. The task was, in any meaningful sense, trivially easy. And then he introduced the mechanism. The mechanism was deception, which made Asch uncomfortable, and this discomfort is worth noting because it tells you something about who he was. He did not enjoy deceiving people. He believed that science required honesty and that the subjects in his studies were not simply instruments, but he could not think of another way to answer his question. The real subjects in his study would believe they were participating in a group visual perception test. What they would not know was that every other person in the room, all 7 or 8 of the other men seated beside them, were Confederates, actors. They had been carefully briefed before the session. On certain trials, the critical trials, they would unanimously give the wrong answer. The wrong answer, loudly, confidently, without hesitation, and then the real subject, always seated last or second to last in the row, would have to make their judgment in full view and full hearing of this unanimous incorrect consensus. Asch ran the study beginning in 1951. 123 male college students participated as real subjects, each unaware of the setup, each believing they were in a straightforward perception test with a group of peers. Each real subject faced 18 comparison trials. On 12 of those trials, the Confederates gave wrong answers. Asch and his team watched through observation windows. They took notes on the subjects' faces and posture. They paid attention to what happened to a person in the moment between hearing the group and giving their own answer. What they expected to find was, at most, a modest conformity effect. Asch believed in human rationality. He believed, or he hoped, that people would trust their own eyes. He thought perhaps some individuals, particularly anxious or insecure ones, might conform on a trial or two. He thought the data would ultimately demonstrate the resilience of independent judgment. He was wrong in a way that changed him. Across all the critical trials, the real subjects gave the wrong answer, the same wrong answer as the Confederates, 37% of the time. Not 1%, not 5%, 37%. More than 1 in 3 of all answers, in a task where the correct answer was visible to anyone who looked, were wrong answers that matched the group. And within this overall figure was something even more disturbing. 75% of subjects conformed at least once. 3 out of every 4 people given enough pressure from a unanimous group said something they could see with their own eyes was not true. Now here is the sentence that seems to be going somewhere else. The people in Asch's study were not frightened. They were not being threatened. There was no punishment for disagreement. No one was going to lose a job or face social exile or suffer any physical harm. They were college students doing a vision test on a Tuesday morning. They had nothing to lose and they knew it. And yet 75% of them still looked at an obviously wrong answer and said it out loud. What the data was describing was not cowardice in the face of danger. It was something quieter and more fundamental than that. It was the power of social reality to override physical reality in a brain that was, at its core, built to do exactly that. After the sessions, Asch conducted careful post-experiment interviews with every real subject. What he found in those interviews haunted him more than the numbers. The subjects divided into 3 groups. A small number, the independent ones who never conformed or only conformed once, reported that they had noticed the group's disagreement, but had simply continued trusting their own perception. Some of them were uncomfortable with the disagreement, but they held their ground. Then there was a second group, larger, who conformed sometimes but knew they were conforming. They heard themselves say the wrong answer and they knew as they said it that it was wrong. Some of them found reasons afterward to make this feel acceptable. They told themselves the group probably had better lighting or a better angle or some information they lacked. They confabulated justifications for a decision their nervous system had already made. And then there was a third group, the one that kept Asch awake, the people who conformed consistently across most of the critical trials and who, in the post-experiment interview, reported genuine uncertainty about what they had actually seen. These people had not decided to lie. They had not decided anything. Something had happened in the space between perception and statement that altered what they believed they had perceived. If you have reached this point in the video and you are feeling unsettled in a way that feels important, that feeling is the point. Subscribing to the Human Code means the next time we go somewhere like this, you will be there. What was happening in those subjects' minds, particularly the third group? requires understanding something about how the human brain processes social information, and it requires going back considerably further than 1951. About 200,000 years further, human beings did not evolve in a world where independent judgment was reliably the safest strategy. They evolved in small groups of between 20 and 150 individuals, groups where the cost of being wrong was physical and immediate, and where the cost of social exclusion was, statistically speaking, death. If you were rejected by the group in the Pleistocene, you did not suffer mildly reduced social status. You died of exposure or predation within weeks. The brain that survived this environment was not the brain that optimized for being independently correct. It was the brain that optimized for being aligned with the group. This is not a flaw in the human brain. It is the original design. Social information, the behavior and expressions and statements of other people around you, is among the most reliable data your nervous system has access to. If 7 people around you react with fear to a sound you cannot yet hear, updating your threat assessment upward is rational. If 7 people around you point at an empty corner of the room and stare with expressions of intense interest, your visual system will actually work harder in that corner, scanning for whatever they are perceiving. The brain does not treat social consensus as opinion. It treats social consensus as evidence. And for 200,000 years in most situations, this was exactly the right thing to do. In 1951, in a classroom at Swarthmore, it was the wrong thing to do. But the brain did not know the difference, because the brain was not built to know the difference. It was built to integrate social information into perception automatically, rapidly, and at a level that precedes conscious deliberation. The subjects in Asch's study who reported genuine perceptual uncertainty were not lying in their interviews. Something in their perceptual processing had genuinely been disrupted by the social signal. Neuroimaging studies conducted decades later by the neuroscientist Gregory Burns and his colleagues at Emory University put people through asch-style conformity paradigms inside functional MRI machines and found that social pressure did not primarily activate the regions associated with conscious decision-making or deliberate lying. It activated the visual processing regions. The conforming brain was not deciding to say something false. It was, in a measurable and physical sense, beginning to see something different. Burns published these findings in 2005, over 50 years after Asch had run his original study, and the discovery that conformity operated at the level of perception rather than just conscious choice was in its own quiet way as disturbing as Asch's original numbers. Because it meant that the people who told themselves they would simply rely on their own eyes were misunderstanding the architecture of their own experience. Your eyes do not deliver unmediated reality to your consciousness. Your visual system is a prediction machine that is constantly incorporating prior information, including social prior information, into what it shows you. When the people around you see something different, the signal that reaches your awareness has already been partially adjusted. There's something else about Asch's study that almost nobody knows, because it tends to get left out of the standard summaries that appear in introductory psychology textbooks. Asch was not satisfied with discovering the effect. He wanted to understand its boundaries, so he ran a series of variations, and these variations are more important than the original finding. In one variation, he gave the real subject a single ally, just one person in the group who also gave the correct answer, meaning the real subject was no longer facing a unanimous majority. They were facing a majority of 7-1 with a single dissenting voice beside them. Conformity did not drop modestly. Conformity collapsed. The error rate in the ally condition fell from 37% to approximately 5%. One person saying the correct answer was enough to dramatically restore the subject's ability to trust their own perception. Asch called this finding the most hopeful result of the entire series, because it meant that the power of unanimous consensus was not simply the power of numbers. It was specifically the power of unanimity. The appearance of total agreement, with no crack and no dissent, was doing almost all of the psychological work. The moment a single alternative voice existed in the room, the spell broke. In another variation, Asch had the single dissenter give an answer that was wrong, but differently wrong than the majority. The real subject was now facing a group that said a dissenter who said B, and a correct answer of C. Conformity to the majority still declined dramatically. The dissenter was not providing support, was not validating the subject's perception, was in fact getting the wrong answer himself. But his existence alone, his willingness to say something different than the group, was enough to free the real subject to trust what they saw. This is the version of the finding that keeps researchers up at night because its implication is that what subjects needed was not a guide. They needed permission. Permission, in the form of a single other person's willingness to deviate from consensus, to act on what they already knew. Asch also varied the size of the majority. He tested what happened when only 1 or 2 Confederates gave wrong answers instead of 7. Conformity was much lower with a single person. It increased as the majority grew, but it plateaued somewhere around 3 to 4 Confederates. Adding more Confederates beyond 4 did not substantially increase conformity. The power came from the experience of facing a group, not from the number of people in the group per se. Now, here is where this becomes about you, and not about a college student named Paul in 1951. Studies conducted in the decades following Asch's original work have tried to identify which kinds of people resist conformity and which kinds of people yield to it. If you are like most people who learn about the asch experiments, your working hypothesis is that you would have been in the resistant group. You think you know yourself well enough to say that. You trust your own perception. You are not the kind of person who says something they can see as false. You are perhaps even a little contemptuous of the people who did, in the same quiet way that people who have never been in a particular situation tend to be contemptuous of those who have. Here is what the research found about people who were most confident they would resist. In studies examining the relationship between self-reported independence and actual conformity behavior, subjects who expressed the most certainty before the experiment that they would not conform were not the subjects most likely to resist. In some studies, they were actually more likely to conform. The mechanism here is not paradoxical once you understand it. Overconfidence about resistance to social pressure correlates with less mental preparation for the moment when that pressure arrives. The person who genuinely expects the pressure and has thought carefully about how they will respond to it behaves differently than the person who has dismissed the possibility because they believe their character makes it irrelevant. The first person has a plan. The second person has a self-image. There is also the question of what the situation actually feels like from the inside, which most people who have not been in it are picturing incorrectly. When you imagine yourself in the asch scenario, you probably imagine the moment of choice as a clear and conscious one, a moment when you hear the group say A and you internally say no and then say C out loud. What subjects in the real study described was different. They described a growing disorientation, a sense that something was wrong but not a clear sense of what. A feeling of unreality that crept in between the moment of perception and the moment of response. Several described experiencing a brief, involuntary uncertainty about whether they were seeing the lines correctly, a kind of vertigo that arrived uninvited. The person who tells themselves they would simply rely on their own eyes has not accounted for the fact that the eyes themselves become unreliable under social pressure, not because of stupidity or weakness, but because of neuroscience. And there is a third factor, which Asch discovered in his interviews and which subsequent researchers have confirmed. The subjects who conformed were not only affected by what the group said, they were affected by the social cost of making the group wrong. When you say C and 7 people have said A, you are not just asserting a different answer. You are implying that 7 other people in the room have failed at a trivially simple task. You are, in effect, telling them publicly that they are wrong. Many subjects described an intense discomfort at this prospect that they found difficult to explain, because it was disproportionate to the stakes. It was a minor visual test. Nobody cared, and yet the prospect of standing publicly apart from the group and making them collectively incorrect felt, at the level of the nervous system, like a threat. Because at the level of the nervous system, that is exactly what it is. Threat to belonging. Threat to group membership. threat to the social standing that the older parts of the brain still process as a matter of survival, regardless of what the newer parts know about college classrooms and mild-mannered psychological researchers. Here is the thing that Asch himself eventually said about what his research meant, which is rarely quoted and rarely remembered. In a lecture he gave years after the original study, he said that the finding did not lead him to despair about human nature. It led him to a specific kind of concern about social structures. He argued that the conformity effect was not primarily evidence of individual weakness. It was evidence of what individuals were capable of when the social environment was designed in a particular way. The question was not what kind of people were likely to conform. The question was what kind of situations produced conformity in almost any person. And the answer was situations characterized by two specific features: unanimity among the perceived authorities or peers, and the absence of any acknowledged dissent. This is not a historical observation. This is a description of environments that exist right now in your workplace, in your family, in the media ecosystem you inhabit, in every room you walk into where consensus has already formed before you arrived and where the cost of disagreeing visibly is felt to be social. The asch experiment did not happen once in 1951 and then get filed away. It happens every day in every human organization on Earth, at every meeting where someone says something they do not believe because the room believed something else. At every dinner table where someone lets a claim pass unchallenged because challenging it felt like too much. At every vote where someone marked a ballot according to what they thought others around them expected rather than what they actually believed. What is worth knowing about Solomon Asch, the thing that almost no one who discusses his study bothers to mention, is that he spent the last decades of his career trying to find a way out of the conclusion his data forced him toward. He was not a pessimist by nature. He believed in human dignity and human rationality, and he had built his career on the idea that people were capable of genuine moral independence. His own experiment embarrassed him in a way that was not professional but personal. He ran follow-up studies looking for personality variables that predicted resistance. He found some, modest ones. He found that people with higher cognitive complexity, people who tended to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously and felt comfortable with ambiguity, conformed somewhat less. He found that people who had previously experienced their own judgment, vindicated after disagreeing with a group, who had some stored evidence that independent thought paid off, were somewhat more resistant. He found that cultural context mattered, that studies run in more collectivist cultures showed higher conformity rates, and studies run in more individualist ones showed somewhat lower rates, though the effect was present everywhere. But the core finding was durable, across decades, across cultures, across variations in the method. The majority of people, when faced with unanimous social pressure to say something false about something they could plainly see, said it. Not all of them, not always, but enough and often enough to prevent anyone from comfortably placing themselves outside the pattern. Asch died in 1996, and by the end of his life he had made a kind of peace with his own results, not by dismissing them, but by insisting they contained something other than condemnation. He argued that the same social sensitivity that produced conformity in his experiments was the root of empathy, cooperation, and the human capacity for collective moral action. The brain that updated its perception based on others was the brain that could also be moved by others' suffering, that could align itself with others' goals, that could participate in the kind of distributed intelligence that built languages and cities and legal systems. The problem was not the sensitivity. The problem was the situations. There is a detail from the original sessions that Asch described in his 1956 monograph, and that tends to vanish in popular retellings because it does not fit neatly into the story of social pressure and moral failure. Some subjects, the ones who held their ground trial after trial, who kept saying C when everyone else said A, became visibly distressed by the end of the session. Not the subjects who conformed. The ones who resisted. They held their ground, but they were not unaffected. They sat in their chairs at the end of a row and kept saying what they could see, while 7 confident voices said something else. And by the 16th and 17th trial, some of them were pale, some of them were sweating. One subject described in Ash's notes spent several of the final trials speaking very quietly and directing his gaze at the floor as he gave his correct answer, as if he had found a way to remove himself from the social field by looking away from the people whose reality he was contradicting. These people did the right thing, and it cost them something. It cost them something real that sat in their nervous systems as if they had survived a threat, because in the terms their nervous systems understood, they had. This is the part of the experiment that is hardest to sit with, because it removes the easy comfort of the hero narrative. You want to be the person who held their ground, but holding your ground in that room was not a free action. It was not simply a matter of noticing what was true and saying so. It required overriding something that felt dangerous repeatedly for the duration of the session in full view of people who were uniformly signaling that you were the one who was wrong. The subjects who did this deserve admiration, but they also deserve acknowledgement that what they overcame was not an imaginary obstacle, not a social nicety, not a trivial discomfort. It was a signal from the deepest layer of their social brain, a signal with the biochemical fingerprint of threat telling them to stop. Follow-up work by later researchers found that the physiological stress response, measured through heart rate and galvanic skin response, was actually higher in subjects who resisted conformity than in subjects who went along with the group. The people who said the right answer were more physiologically stressed than the people who said the wrong one. Because going along with the group, even when the group is wrong, is calming to a nervous system that was built to treat belonging as safety. Disagreeing with the group, even when you are correct, is alarming to a nervous system that was built to treat exclusion as danger. There is a real-world parallel to the asch findings that requires no stretch of imagination to recognize, because most people have experienced a version of it within the past year. Think about the last time you were in a meeting or a conversation or a social situation where a claim was made that you were fairly sure was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just wrong, and the people around you seemed to accept it. Maybe they nodded. Maybe nobody challenged it. Maybe the moment passed and the conversation moved on, and you sat there with your private disagreement and said nothing. And then later, you found out that you had been right. Think about what happened in that moment of silence. Think about the calculation your brain ran. Think about how fast it ran it, and how little of it was conscious. You were not being cowardly. You were being human. Your nervous system was running a program that is approximately 200,000 years old, and it was running it correctly according to its own design specifications. The problem is that those specifications were written for a world where the people whose consensus you needed to survive were the people in the room with you. They were not written for a world where the people in the room with you might simply be wrong. Asch's experiment also produced a finding that almost never appears in the mainstream summary, a finding about what happens after the session ends. When subjects who had conformed significantly were told the full truth of the experiment in the debriefing, many of them did not feel relieved. Some felt a kind of retroactive confusion about their own experience. They could not fully reconstruct the internal state they had been in during the critical trials. Some could not remember, or did not want to remember, that they had experienced genuine perceptual uncertainty. Others remembered clearly that they had known the answer was wrong but said it anyway, and they found this memory more disturbing than they had expected, because in the warm light of the debriefing room with a researcher explaining that their response was normal and well documented and shared by 75% of participants, it was still not possible to feel entirely okay about it. The knowledge that everyone does it did not dissolve the specific memory of having done it. And some of these subjects, in their written post-experiment reflections, wrote things that asch saved and referenced for years afterward. Things like, "I did not think I was the kind of person who did that." Things like, "I need to think about when else I might have done that without knowing it was happening." These are the right questions. They are the questions that justify the discomfort of knowing this about yourself, because the discomfort that prompts them is not the end of something. It is the beginning of something. The psychologist Lee Rossbuilding, decades later, on asch's work, developed what he called naive realism, the universal human tendency to believe that we perceive the world as it actually is. that our internal representation of reality is unmediated and accurate, and that people who perceive it differently are therefore wrong or biased or have been corrupted by some interest we do not share. Naive realism is not stupidity. It is the default operating assumption of a brain that cannot directly access any reality except the one it constructs. You cannot step outside your own perception to verify it. You can only use other information, including social information, to calibrate it. The tragedy of the asch experiment is not that people are weak. It is that the calibration instrument we rely on most heavily, social consensus, is itself subject to manipulation and distortion and simple error, and we have no direct way to know when it is failing. What becomes possible when you know this? When you sit with it long enough to actually absorb rather than just register it, is not a plan to resist social pressure heroically. That is the wrong takeaway because the data does not support it as a reliable strategy and because the attempt to position yourself as the heroic independent thinker is itself a social performance, a way of managing your identity in the eyes of others, which means it is still subject to social dynamics rather than free from them. What becomes possible is something more modest and more durable. It is the habit of pausing in the moment between hearing the group and giving your answer. Not to doubt the group on principle, but to notice whether you are actually registering any private uncertainty about what you perceived before you heard them. That pause, that small act of internal inventory, is the thing that asch's resistant subjects seem to have in common. They were not stronger or smarter or more courageous in any general sense. They had, for whatever combination of reasons, developed a habit of consulting their own perception before updating it according to social input. Not a refusal to update. A sequence. Their perception first, then the group. Not the other way around. Asch did not provide this as advice. He would have found the framing too tidy. He spent his career trying to understand a mechanism in the human mind, and what he understood by the end was that the mechanism was not going to be dismantled. It was too old and too deep and too useful in the vast majority of circumstances where human beings use it well. What he thought could be changed, and what he thought education and self-knowledge were for, was the individual's awareness that the mechanism existed, not the elimination of social sensitivity, the cultivation of the moment before it activates, the small, quiet, countercultural act of checking with yourself before you check with the room. Paul, the young man with the coffee cup, was a real subject in asch's 1951 study. His name in the records is not Paul. I have given him that name because he deserves one. What he said when it was his turn has been lost to the archive. He may have said C. He may have said A. What is certain is that the moment before he opened his mouth was a moment of a kind that almost no one around him would ever understand, a moment of being alone inside a social field, with the full weight of human evolutionary history pressing in one direction and the plain evidence of his own eyes pressing in the other. Whatever he said, he was not a different species from you. He was not a weaker or simpler version of you. He was in a situation that had been carefully designed by one of the most rigorous psychologists of the 20th century to produce exactly the response it produced. The situation worked on him the way it works on almost everyone. The question the entire sequence of findings builds toward is not whether you would have done better. The data has already answered that, in a way that should be humbling rather than crushing. The question is something smaller and more actionable and ultimately more honest than the heroic version. Think about the last time you heard a room agree on something and felt, somewhere in your chest, a small private disagreement that you said nothing about. What exactly made you decide to stay quiet?